On a frosty winter morning, Karen, a former tracker, found himself deep in the rugged mountains, following the faint signs of a creature that had piqued his instincts. But what he stumbled upon was no ordinary discovery. A lone dog tethered to an ancient tree, eyes gleaming with a haunting story. What secrets were buried in this desolate wilderness? Stay tuned, because what happens next will change Karen's life forever. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Karen's breath fogged in the frigid mountain air as he adjusted the straps of his heavy backpack. The rugged terrain stretched endlessly before him, blanketed by shimmering white snow that crunched underfoot. A seasoned tracker, Karen had been exploring these mountains for years, drawn by the elusive beauty of nature and the thrill of discovery. Today, he was on the trail of a rare snow fox, a creature so elusive it was often considered a myth by locals. The wind howled through the towering pines, rattling frost-covered branches. Karen scanned the horizon, his sharp eyes searching for signs of life amidst the wintry stillness. Fresh fox tracks crisscrossed the icy ground, faint yet promising. He knelt to inspect them closely, his gloved fingers brushing the delicate indentations. They were recent, perhaps only an hour old. Driven by instinct, Karen pressed on, his senses heightened. The cold bit through his thick jacket, but he barely noticed. Years of tracking had taught him patience and resilience. The mountains held secrets, and only those who respected their rhythm would be rewarded. As he trudged further into the wilderness, a sudden sound shattered the tranquil silence. A faint, high-pitched whimper carried on the icy breeze. Karen froze, every muscle tensing. It was not the call of a fox or any wild animal he was familiar with. The sound was desperate, filled with a sorrow that tugged at his heart. Curiosity and concern propelled him forward. He followed the sound, his boots sinking into deep snow with each step. The whimpering grew louder, more distinct, guiding him through a dense thicket of frost-covered pines. Branches clawed at his clothes, but he pushed through, driven by an unshakable need to find the source of the pitiful cries. Breaking through the thicket, Karen stumbled into a clearing. The sight before him made him stop in his tracks, breath catching in his throat. Tied to a weathered cedar tree was a dog, an Akita, regal despite its haggard appearance. Its thick coat was matted with ice and dirt, and its ribs jutted sharply against its sides. The dog shivered violently, its eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. Karen's heart clenched at the pitiful sight. He had encountered stray animals before, but there was something different about this one. The dog's gaze was intelligent, almost pleading, as if it understood the gravity of its situation and was begging for help. Slowly, Karen approached, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Hey there, buddy," he murmured softly, his voice gentle. "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you." The dog's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but it remained rooted in place, restrained by the frayed rope that bit into its neck. Karen's sharp eyes noticed the rope was tied with a precise knot, one he recognized from his days learning survival techniques. This wasn't some random act of abandonment. Someone had deliberately left the dog here. As he drew closer, Karen's gaze fell on the dog's collar. It wasn't a simple leather strap like most pets wore. This collar was sturdy and reinforced, designed for durability. And hanging from it was a small metallic device that glinted in the weak winter sunlight. Karen's brow furrowed. He knelt cautiously, maintaining eye contact with the dog, who watched him intently but showed no signs of aggression. "You're a tough one, aren't you?" Karen whispered, reaching out slowly. The dog flinched but didn't pull away. His fingers brushed against the collar, and he carefully examined the metallic object attached to it. It was a tracking device, sleek and high-tech, the kind used by professionals for wildlife research or security purposes. This discovery only deepened the mystery. "Who left you here?" Karen wondered aloud, his voice filled with both curiosity and anger. The dog's eyes never wavered from his face, as if silently urging him to understand. Karen's fingers worked deftly to untie the knot securing the rope to the tree. The dog stood trembling but obedient, its discipline evident even in its weakened state. Once freed, it staggered slightly but quickly found its balance. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Karen said softly, his hand hovering near the dog's head. "But you're safe now." To his surprise, the dog leaned into his touch, a tentative gesture of trust that made Karen's throat tighten. There was a resilience in this creature that mirrored his own stubborn will to survive. He rummaged through his backpack, pulling out a protein bar and a collapsible water bowl. The dog watched intently as he poured water into the bowl, its ears perking up at the sound. Karen broke the protein bar into small pieces, offering them one by one. "Easy now," he coaxed as the dog devoured the food with controlled hunger. Its discipline was remarkable, a clear sign of training. This was no ordinary stray. As the dog ate, Karen's mind raced with questions. Who had left this magnificent animal tied to a tree in the middle of nowhere? And why? The tracking device hinted at something far more complex than mere abandonment. Once the dog had eaten its fill, Karen packed up his supplies and stood. "Come on, buddy," he said, patting his leg. "Let's get out of here." The dog hesitated for a moment, then fell into step beside him, its movements still shaky but determined. Karen felt a surge of protectiveness toward his newfound companion. Whatever mystery surrounded this dog, he was determined to uncover the truth. As they made their way back through the forest, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was just the beginning of something much bigger. The mountains had revealed one of their secrets, but many more lay hidden beneath the snow. And with the dog by his side, Karen knew he was about to embark on a journey unlike any he had ever experienced. The wind howled through the desolate wilderness, carrying with it the sharp bite of winter. The dense forest stretched endlessly in every direction, a fortress of towering pines coated with shimmering frost. Karen stood at the edge of the clearing, his breath visible in the frigid air as he surveyed the scene. His sharp eyes scanned every detail, honed by years of tracking in some of the harshest terrains imaginable. The Akita, now freed from its bindings, stayed close to his side, its body still trembling from cold and exhaustion. Despite its weakened state, there was an undeniable intelligence in the dog's gaze, as if it understood the gravity of their situation. Karen knelt beside the animal, giving its thick fur a reassuring pat. "We'll figure this out, buddy," he murmured. His attention shifted to the ground. The fresh snowfall had preserved tracks that told a story waiting to be unraveled. Karen's instincts kicked in, years of experience guiding his assessment. The first thing he noticed was a series of heavy boot prints embedded in the ice. They were deep and deliberate, suggesting the wearer had been carrying a significant load. Karen traced the path of the boot prints with his eyes. They led away from the cedar tree where the dog had been tied, disappearing into the dense undergrowth. But it wasn't just the boot prints that caught his attention. Parallel to them were faint tire marks, barely discernible beneath the thin layer of snow. The tires had likely belonged to an off-road vehicle, the kind used for navigating rough, uncharted terrain. "This wasn't random," Karen muttered, his voice low and thoughtful. "Someone brought you here on purpose." The dog tilted its head as if listening intently. Karen rose to his feet, his mind racing. The presence of both boot prints and tire marks suggested a coordinated effort. Whoever had left the dog here hadn't simply stumbled upon this remote location. They had planned it, and that raised troubling questions. Why go to such lengths to abandon a highly trained dog in the middle of nowhere? Karen's gaze swept the clearing, noting subtle disturbances in the landscape. Broken branches, patches of trampled snow, and discarded cigarette butts all pointed to recent human activity. He knelt again, picking up one of the cigarette butts between his gloved fingers. It was fresh, the filter barely stained, and hadn't yet absorbed moisture from the snow. "Whoever you are, you were just here," Karen said under his breath. The dog sniffed the air, its nose twitching as it picked up scents that Karen couldn't detect. The animal's discipline was remarkable. Despite its obvious fatigue, it remained alert, its body tense with focus. Karen's thoughts drifted back to the peculiar tracking device attached to the dog's collar. He hadn't seen anything quite like it before, but its sleek design and sturdy construction suggested advanced technology. It wasn't the kind of equipment an average pet owner would use. "You're special, aren't you?" Karen mused, glancing down at the dog. "Someone went to a lot of trouble to bring you here and leave you behind." The dog responded with a soft whine, as if acknowledging the truth of Karen's words. Deciding to follow the trail, Karen adjusted his pack and set off in the direction of the boot prints. The dog trotted beside him, its gait uneven but determined. The forest closed in around them, the towering pines casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. The trail was faint but discernible to Karen's trained eye. He noted the subtle signs that others might overlook. A snapped twig here, a scuffed patch of snow there. Each clue painted a picture of movement and intent. They walked in silence, the only sounds being the crunch of snow beneath their feet and the occasional rustle of branches swaying in the wind. Karen's senses remained on high alert, every fiber of his being attuned to the environment. After about half a mile, they came across a small clearing where the snow had been disturbed in a wide arc. Karen's brow furrowed as he examined the scene. The boot prints fanned out in multiple directions, suggesting that whoever had been here had paused, perhaps to assess their surroundings or set up camp. In the center of the clearing, partially obscured by snow, was a patch of scorched earth. Karen knelt, brushing away the frost to reveal the charred remains of a fire pit. The ashes were cold, but recent enough to indicate that the fire had been extinguished within the last 24 hours. The dog sniffed the ground intently, circling the fire pit as if trying to make sense of the lingering scents. Karen's eyes narrowed as he spotted something glinting in the snow near the edge of the clearing. He reached for it, his gloved fingers closing around a small metallic object. Holding it up to the light, he realized it was a spent shell casing. A sense of unease settled over him. Firearms weren't uncommon in these remote areas, but combined with the other clues, the presence of a shell casing hinted at something more sinister. "What happened here?" Karen murmured, his voice barely audible. The dog let out a low growl, its body tense. Karen followed the animal's gaze to a thicket of bushes on the far side of the clearing. The branches were bent and broken, suggesting someone had forced their way through recently. "Looks like we have a direction," Karen said. Rising to his feet, they pushed through the undergrowth, branches snagging at their clothes. The forest grew denser, the air heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. Karen's pulse quickened as they emerged onto another trail, this one narrower and less traveled. The boot prints reappeared here, accompanied by additional tire marks. Karen's instincts told him they were getting closer to something important. The dog seemed to sense it too, its ears perked and nose to the ground. Despite its earlier exhaustion, the animal moved with renewed energy, driven by an unseen force. As they continued along the trail, Karen's mind raced with possibilities. The presence of the tracking device, the meticulous way the dog had been tied to the tree, and the signs of recent human activity all pointed to a deliberate operation. But what was the purpose? The trail led them to a rocky outcrop that overlooked a frozen valley. Karen paused, catching his breath. The dog stood beside him, its gaze fixed on the horizon. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, was a structure. A cabin, weathered by time and the elements. Smoke curled from its chimney, a sign of life in this otherwise desolate landscape. Karen's instincts flared. Whoever was in that cabin might hold the answers he sought. "We're close," he said to the dog. "Let's go." They descended the rocky path carefully, their movements deliberate. The dog stayed close, its body tense with anticipation. As they approached the cabin, Karen's grip on his knife tightened. The truth was within reach, but he knew better than to let his guard down. The dog let out a low growl, its eyes locked on the cabin door. Karen's pulse quickened. Whatever lay ahead, he was ready to face it, and he knew he wouldn't be facing it alone. Karen knelt in the snow, his breath clouding the frigid air as he rummaged through his pack. The Akita stood a few feet away, its amber eyes wary but curious. Despite being freed from the rope that had bound it to the cedar, the dog remained tense, as if waiting for some unseen signal to flee or attack. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Karen murmured softly, glancing at the dog as he pulled out a small thermal blanket and a protein bar. "But I'm not here to hurt you." The dog tilted its head slightly, its ears flicking forward. Karen noted the posture, alert but disciplined, not the panicked demeanor of a typical stray. This dog had been trained, that much was clear. Even in its weakened state, it carried itself with a soldier's poise. Karen slowly unwrapped the protein bar, letting the sound of the crinkling wrapper carry through the stillness of the forest. The dog's nose twitched, its hunger evident despite the stoic expression it maintained. Breaking the bar into small pieces, Karen held out his gloved hand, palm open. "Here, buddy. It's safe," he coaxed, keeping his voice low and steady. The dog hesitated, eyes flicking between Karen and the offering. It took a cautious step forward, then another until it was close enough to sniff the food. For a tense moment, Karen held his breath, unsure if the dog would trust him enough to take the offering. Then, with surprising gentleness, the dog lapped up the pieces of protein bar from Karen's palm. Its movements were controlled, deliberate, as if even eating was a disciplined act. "Good boy," Karen whispered, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "See? Not so bad." Encouraged by the dog's response, Karen set the rest of the protein bar on the ground and reached for the collapsible water bowl in his pack. He filled it with water from his canteen, the liquid steaming slightly in the cold air. The dog watched intently but waited, showing remarkable restraint. "You don't eat or drink until you're told? Huh?" Karen mused, shaking his head in amazement. "Definitely not a regular pet." He nudged the bowl slightly toward the dog. "Go ahead," he urged. The dog seemed to understand the permission granted. It lowered its head and drank carefully, pausing between sips as if monitoring its intake. Karen couldn't help but be impressed. Whoever had trained this dog had done an exceptional job. As the dog finished drinking, Karen extended the thermal blanket toward it. "This'll help with the cold," he said gently. The dog eyed the blanket warily but didn't back away as Karen draped it over its back. The warmth seemed to soothe the animal, and it let out a soft sigh, its body relaxing ever so slightly. "There you go," Karen said softly. "Not so scary now, is it?" They sat in companionable silence for a while, the wind rustling through the trees around them. The dog remained close, its presence grounding Karen in the vast wilderness. He hadn't expected to find a companion on this trip, let alone one as remarkable as this Akita. "You need a name," Karen said thoughtfully, studying the dog. "Can't just keep calling you buddy. How about Shiro?" The dog's ears perked up at the sound, as if testing the name. "Yeah, Shiro suits you," Karen said with a nod. Strong, smart, and a little mysterious, Shiro seemed to accept the name, his tail giving a faint wag, the first sign of genuine trust. Karen's curiosity about Shiro deepened with each passing moment. The dog's advanced training was undeniable. Even in its weakened state, Shiro displayed remarkable discipline and intelligence. The way he responded to subtle cues, the precision of his movements, and his ability to remain calm under stress all pointed to a background far from ordinary. "You're not just any dog, are you?" Karen said, his voice low. "You've got a story, and I bet it's tied to something dangerous." Shiro's eyes met Karen's, and for a moment, it felt as though the dog understood every word. The wind picked up, carrying with it the biting chill of the mountains. Karen knew they couldn't stay exposed for much longer. He stood, brushing snow from his knees. "Come on, Shiro. Let's find some real shelter." Shiro rose to his feet, his movements still a bit shaky but determined. He fell into step beside Karen with a precision that spoke volumes about his training. There was no hesitation, no need for commands, just an innate understanding that they were now a team. As they navigated the treacherous terrain, Karen tested Shiro's responses. A simple hand gesture brought the dog to a halt. A slight tilt of Karen's head prompted Shiro to move in the indicated direction. The dog's obedience was seamless, as if they had been working together for years rather than mere hours. "You're incredible," Karen said, genuinely impressed. "Whoever trained you knew what they were doing." They continued through the forest, Karen's mind racing with questions. Shiro's presence was a mystery wrapped in layers of intrigue. The tracking device on his collar, the disciplined behavior, and the deliberate manner in which he had been abandoned all hinted at a story that needed unraveling. But for now, survival was the priority. Karen spotted a natural alcove formed by a cluster of boulders, partially shielded from the wind. It wasn't perfect, but it would provide some protection from the elements. "This'll have to do for now," Karen said, leading Shiro toward the makeshift shelter. He cleared a space on the ground, spreading out another thermal blanket for Shiro. The dog settled down, his body finally relaxing as he felt the warmth beneath him. Karen built a small fire, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows across the snow-covered ground. The heat was a welcome relief from the biting cold. As they sat by the fire, Karen's thoughts returned to Shiro's mysterious past. "Someone left you out here for a reason," he said quietly. "But why? And who were they?" Shiro's ears flicked at the sound of Karen's voice, but he remained calm, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "We'll figure it out," Karen promised. Together, the bond between them was already forming, born out of necessity but solidified by mutual respect and trust. Karen knew that Shiro wasn't just a dog. He was a partner, one who would stand by his side through whatever challenges lay ahead. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, Karen felt a renewed sense of purpose. Shiro's story was intertwined with his own now, and together, they would uncover the truth hidden in the wilderness. As Karen and his team wound their way through the rugged mountain trails, the landscape around them grew more and more isolated. The air grew thin, and the sounds of nature were muted by the relentless wind that whipped through the craggy peaks. Every step felt heavier, the weight of their mission pressing down on them. The further they advanced, the more Karen's instincts kicked into high gear. It was during a brief stop to catch their breath that Karen's sharp eyes caught something out of place. The snow beneath their boots had been disturbed in several areas, leading him to a small, hidden compartment camouflaged against the surrounding terrain. The compartment was cleverly designed, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. His pulse quickened as he crouched to examine the contents, equipment he immediately recognized from his time in the service. It was military-grade, top-secret gear meant for covert operations. "Over here," he called to the others, his voice steady but carrying a sense of urgency. His fingers brushed over the items with a mix of caution and familiarity. Thermal sensors, communications equipment, and even a few supply packs, all showing signs of wear from exposure but still intact. The presence of these tools wasn't just a coincidence. Karen knew from experience that someone had left them deliberately, and the kind of person who would do so had to have detailed knowledge of the terrain, as well as military-grade training. "Doesn't make sense," Karen muttered under his breath. "These are classified. I had access to these once." His thoughts began to race. Why would someone hide such sensitive equipment in the mountains, in a place where only those with military knowledge would even know how to look for it? He rose to his feet, scanning the surroundings with a sharp gaze. The realization hit him like a wave, the markers on the trees, the subtle signs of surveillance cameras camouflaged in the branches, the faint traces of a path only a trained eye would catch. It was all becoming clear. This wasn't some random stash of gear. This was the work of someone who knew the ins and outs of special operations, someone who had been trained to leave no trace, yet still had enough of an ego to leave behind a signature for those who knew how to spot it. "Stay alert," Karen warned his team, but the sense of unease was now palpable in his voice. As they moved further, his mind couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The markers were everywhere, too precise and too well-placed to be accidental. Someone had anticipated their every move. Whoever this was, they were no stranger to covert operations, perhaps even former military themselves. Karen's mind drifted back to his service days, long before his current life had taken shape. He'd been part of some of the most classified and dangerous missions, operations so sensitive that even the details were hidden from most of the world. The gear in that compartment, those surveillance markers, they were the same tools used by operatives like himself. But there was something about this situation that gnawed at him. These operations, these tactics were his history. Someone, somewhere, was now using that knowledge to manipulate the shadows in ways Karen never thought possible. The further they hiked, the more his thoughts spiraled back into the past. Faces, names, missions he had once been part of, flashed through his mind like a series of broken photographs. Had any of those connections led to this moment? Had someone he knew, someone from his own past, turned against them? As the day wore on, the air grew colder, and the sun dipped lower in the sky. They were now deep into the heart of the mountains, far from any known paths. Karen could feel the tension rise, not just within his team, but in his own chest. This was no longer just a mission, it was personal. He knew that whoever was orchestrating this operation had access to the same training, the same intelligence network that he had once used. But why? Why were they so determined to lead him here? His heart thudded with a realization he wasn't ready to accept. He couldn't ignore the signs any longer. This was no random group of insurgents or rogue elements. This was the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, someone who had been inside the very systems Karen had once been a part of. Someone with access to classified operations, someone with a history that ran parallel to his own. And that could only mean one thing: the person responsible was someone Karen had served with. With that thought, a chill ran down his spine. The betrayal, the deceit, it all started to make sense. The past Karen had carefully buried was now coming back to haunt him. And this time, it wasn't just a memory. It was alive, and it had a purpose. Karen moved silently through the dense underbrush of the forest. His senses heightened with every step. His thoughts remained fixated on the clues they had uncovered earlier. Hidden caches of military equipment, surveillance markers pointing to a meticulous plan. Everything was leading him toward an inescapable conclusion. Whoever was behind these operations, whoever had orchestrated this series of cryptic clues, had knowledge of covert tactics that only someone with a deep military background could possess. But even with this realization, there was still one thing that didn't sit right. The mountain air was biting, and as the team moved forward, Karen could see his breath puff out in white clouds before him. It wasn't just the cold he was feeling. The weight of the situation was pressing on him, building with every passing moment. They were being watched. He could feel it. Every crackling sound in the trees, every rustle of the wind in the snow-covered ground, had him instinctively reaching for his weapon. He knew the drill. He knew when to trust his gut. And right now, his gut was telling him that they weren't alone. Suddenly, from behind the thick line of trees, the faint sound of footsteps reached his ears. His heart skipped a beat. Karen motioned for his team to halt. He raised a hand, signaling for them to crouch low and remain out of sight. His eyes narrowed, scanning the forest ahead. In an instant, everything went from stillness to chaos. From the shadows, armed figures emerged with swift precision, taking up positions to encircle Karen and his team. There were no warning shots, no chance to retreat. The ambush had been planned with ruthless efficiency. Karen's instincts kicked in before his mind could even process the danger. He dove for cover behind a boulder, pulling one of his teammates with him as the first round of gunfire shattered the air. The harsh crack of bullets whizzing by pierced the silence, and he could hear the rush of air as they missed by mere inches. "Get down!" Karen barked at the others, his voice sharp with urgency. The team scrambled for cover, each one trying to stay out of the line of fire. The attackers were well-trained, moving with military precision, their weapons sharp and ready. Karen's thoughts raced. Whoever these people were, they were good. Too good. They knew the terrain, they knew their every move, and they were prepared for everything. It was a classic ambush, but something about it felt off. There was a precision to their attack that made Karen uneasy. He had seen this kind of tactical awareness before, the kind that came from personal experience. Whoever was leading this operation had the same training, the same mentality that Karen had once shared. The realization made his skin crawl. It was becoming clear that whoever was behind this operation had been in his shoes before. But before he could strategize his next move, he heard it, the sound of rapid footsteps approaching from the opposite side of the clearing. His heart skipped a beat, and he instinctively shifted into position to fire. But then, out of nowhere, a blur of white fur and muscle exploded onto the scene. Shiro, the sleek, powerful German shepherd Karen had trained with, charged through the trees with unrelenting force. The dog's movements were a perfect dance of instinct and training, every muscle in his body taut with purpose. He leaped, knocking one of the attackers off balance, his teeth sinking into the man's arm, forcing him to drop his weapon. The ambushers momentarily hesitated, caught off guard by the sheer speed and ferocity of the attack. Karen's heart surged with relief. He had trained Shiro for years, and the dog's response to danger was second nature. But there was no time to savor the moment. Karen quickly rose from his cover, scanning the surroundings as Shiro tackled another assailant. The dog's agility and training had given them the upper hand, but the danger was far from over. Karen's fingers tightened around his weapon, ready to return fire. The attackers were stunned, momentarily disorganized by the sudden onslaught of the K9 unit. Shiro moved like a shadow, his body weaving in and out of the chaos with expert precision, incapacitating one attacker after another. His sharp teeth and powerful jaws delivered incapacitating blows, each strike leaving one less enemy in the field. Karen moved swiftly alongside Shiro, covering his movements as the dog disarmed another attacker with an almost surgical efficiency. There was no hesitation in the way Shiro reacted. The bond between them was unspoken, a perfect synchronization forged through years of training and mutual trust. Shiro was more than a dog. He was a partner, a weapon, a defender. In moments like these, Karen felt invincible, knowing that Shiro had his back. But even as the ambushers were being taken down one by one, Karen's mind was already working, analyzing the situation. This wasn't just a random attack. Whoever these people were, they weren't just a group of rogue soldiers. They had been waiting for something or someone, and it wasn't just Karen they had targeted. There was something bigger at play here. But what? The last of the ambushers went down with a swift snap of Shiro's jaws, and the clearing fell silent once more. The remnants of the attack lay scattered in the snow, their weapons discarded and their bodies slumped against the trees. Karen took a deep breath, his mind still racing, his pulse still thrumming with adrenaline. Shiro trotted over to Karen's side, tail wagging slightly as if to say, "Job well done." Karen crouched down, his fingers grazing the dog's fur as he gave him a quick, affectionate pat. The bond between them was undeniable, but Karen's thoughts were far from the present moment. Something didn't add up. Karen straightened, his eyes scanning the fallen attackers. They were all armed, but they weren't the type to leave such a trail behind. Felt too deliberate, too staged. These weren't just soldiers on a mission. They were part of a larger plan. And Karen had a sinking feeling that the people responsible for this had been in the game long enough to know exactly how to bait him into their trap. But as his eyes flicked over to the man Shiro had incapacitated first, something in the man's hand caught his attention. A small, military-grade transmitter. Karen's heart raced as he quickly moved to retrieve it. This was no ordinary transmitter. It was encrypted, a tool for high-level communication. Whoever was behind this operation was using sophisticated equipment, likely to coordinate movements or track Karen's team. He knew he had to act fast, but one thing in the back of his mind kept gnawing at him. Shiro. Karen paused for a moment, his gaze softening as he looked at the dog. The way Shiro had thrown himself into the fight, the way he had protected Karen and the team, it was as if he had been trained for this exact moment. It wasn't just coincidence. Shiro had been part of an operation before, just like Karen. And now, in the midst of this ambush, Karen realized something that made his stomach turn. The dog had been left for a reason. Shiro had been a decoy. Karen's mind flashed back to an old operation, one he had led years ago, before his life had taken a different turn. It had been a covert mission, one where everything had gone wrong. A mission where some of his team had not made it back, and where Shiro had been the only one to survive. At the time, Karen had believed that Shiro had been left behind, a casualty of an operation gone awry. But now, as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, Karen realized the bitter truth. Shiro had been abandoned on purpose. Whoever had been behind that operation had left Shiro behind as a tool, perhaps to be found, perhaps to be reactivated, but ultimately to serve as a reminder of something Karen had once been part of. A pawn in a game he had long since walked away from. The realization stung, but Karen refused to let it show. This was personal. As Shiro stood by his side, Karen made a silent vow. Whoever had set this in motion, whoever had used his loyal companion as a tool for their own twisted ends, would pay. And it wouldn't be just a rescue mission anymore. It would be a reckoning. The days that followed the ambush were a blur of activity and unrest. Karen's mind was caught in a maelstrom of thoughts, each more urgent than the last. The ambush had been a wake-up call. Someone knew about his past, knew the depths of his training, and was willing to use every weapon at their disposal to drag him back into a world he had left behind. The fragments of the operation, the military-grade equipment, the encrypted transmitter, it all pointed to something much larger than Karen had initially anticipated. But amidst the chaos and confusion, one thing remained clear: Shiro. The dog had been more than just a companion in that moment. He had been a protector, a true partner. And Karen knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that Shiro had been there for a reason. They were bound together, and whatever lay ahead, they would face it side by side. They continued their trek through the mountain paths, each step taking them deeper into unknown territory. Karen's nerves were on edge, his senses sharpened. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig underfoot had him ready to move. He knew that whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop. They were too close, too well prepared. But Karen had learned long ago that the best way to deal with danger was to stay one step ahead. And that's when they found it. It was a small cabin tucked away in a remote clearing, almost entirely obscured by trees and rock formations. It had been purposefully hidden, designed to blend in with its surroundings. The structure appeared abandoned, its weathered exterior marked with the passage of time. But Karen's instincts told him otherwise. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he motioned for Shiro to stay close as they approached. Karen wasn't sure why, but something about the place felt wrong. It was as if it had been waiting for them, as if someone had known they would come here eventually. The cabin wasn't just a place of refuge. It was a hiding place for something far more dangerous. He carefully pushed open the door, the creak of the old wood echoing through the air. The inside of the cabin was sparse, an old table, a few chairs, and a small stove. But Karen's eyes immediately landed on the far wall, where a hidden panel had been left slightly ajar. He walked over to it, his heart pounding as his fingers brushed over the cold metal surface. There was a hidden safe, its door barely visible against the wall's dark wood. Karen's breath caught in his throat. He had seen this before. In his previous life, he had come across safe houses like this, places where operations were planned, where evidence was hidden. But the real question was, what kind of operation was being run from here? And who was behind it? Shiro, sensing his tension, stayed close, his ears perked up, ever watchful. Karen crouched in front of the safe, working quickly but carefully to crack the combination. It didn't take long. Years of training had made him proficient in this sort of work, and within moments, the door swung open, revealing its contents. The safe wasn't filled with money or weapons. Instead, it contained a series of encrypted notes, paper files that had been carefully stashed away, each one bearing the kind of information Karen had only dreamed of uncovering. He carefully removed the documents, scanning through them with practiced eyes. There were names, dates, and locations, all cryptically written in a code that only someone with a high-level security clearance could decipher. But Karen didn't need to understand everything immediately. What he did understand was that these documents detailed a series of covert operations, missions, assassinations, and high-level sabotage, things that were never meant to see the light of day. The more Karen sifted through the notes, the clearer the picture became. These operations weren't random. They were all part of a larger plan, a network of power-hungry individuals who were pulling the strings from the shadows. And Karen was now part of it, whether he liked it or not. The encrypted notes provided a trail, a roadmap of sorts, showing the interconnectedness of these dark operations. The people behind them weren't just criminals, they were part of a deeply embedded system, a shadow organization that operated with impunity. Karen's hands clenched into fists as the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a matter of exposing a few bad actors. This was an intricate, well-planned conspiracy, one that spanned far beyond the mountain range, stretching into the highest echelons of government and military organizations. They had been using Karen, manipulating his training, his skills, his very past as a tool to further their own agenda. His mind raced as he thought about the implications. This was bigger than anything he had ever faced. But he knew that, with this evidence, he had the key to bringing it all down. It was time to use his old connections, his old network. People he hadn't spoken to in years but who owed him favors. People he had once trusted with his life. The network was still there, buried deep in the shadows, and Karen was going to use it to dismantle everything that had been built on deception and manipulation. Before he could act on the thought, Shiro nudged his hand, pulling him back to the present. Karen looked down at the dog, who was now sitting at his side, his eyes full of loyalty and understanding. Karen could feel the bond between them growing stronger, more unbreakable with every moment. The connection they shared wasn't just that of man and dog. It was something deeper, a partnership forged in the heat of battle, built on trust and mutual respect. Karen patted Shiro's head, his fingers brushing through the dog's thick fur as he let out a slow breath. "We're not done yet, Shiro," he muttered, more to himself than to the dog. "This is just the beginning." With the encrypted notes secured, Karen wasted no time in making his move. He contacted his old contacts in the intelligence community, people who had been part of the network he had once been deeply involved with. The same people who had, in the past, helped him carry out covert operations, and the same people who owed him favors for the risks he had taken in the field. Karen's message was clear and simple. He had the proof. He had the evidence. And he was willing to trade it for the truth. Within hours, he had a response, a coded message that confirmed they were still listening, still watching. The ball was rolling now. The people behind this conspiracy, the ones who had been hiding in plain sight, would be exposed. Karen's pulse quickened as he prepared for the next phase. This wasn't going to be easy. There would be risks, there would be enemies, and there would be dangers. But Karen was ready. He had to be. As he prepared to leave the cabin and make his way toward the nearest town to rendezvous with his contacts, Karen looked at Shiro, who was once again standing by his side, unwavering. The dog's eyes were steady, filled with the kind of determination that Karen recognized all too well. Shiro wasn't just his companion. He was a reminder of the path Karen had chosen, of the bond they shared, forged in blood and fire, that would not break. For the first time in a long while, Karen felt a sense of purpose. This mission, this fight, wasn't just about clearing his name or uncovering the truth. It was about justice. It was about exposing the lies and taking down the people who had used their power for personal gain. And he wasn't going to stop until it was all brought to light. The door of the cabin creaked as Karen stepped out into the cold mountain air, Shiro close behind him. The world was still a dangerous place, and they had only scratched the surface of the conspiracy that had been set into motion long before they arrived. But Karen knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. The fight ahead wouldn't be easy, but with Shiro by his side, nothing could stand in their way. As they set out toward the unknown, Karen couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of resolve. They were not just survivors, they were warriors, and they had a mission. And together they would see it through. With the conspiracy exposed and the evidence secured, Karen and Shiro had done what they set out to do. The enemies who had operated from the shadows were now being brought into the light, and the powerful figures who had manipulated the system would finally face justice. Karen's journey had been long, filled with danger, betrayal, and loss. But in the end, it wasn't just the mission that had transformed him. It was the realization that he had found something he had long thought lost: purpose. With Shiro by his side, he no longer felt like a man running from his past. He was a man standing tall, a man fighting for what was right. The world they had fought to change was starting to shift, and for the first time in years, Karen felt a sense of peace. The pieces of the conspiracy had been scattered, the truth had been uncovered, and the dark forces that had tried to control it all had been exposed. As they walked away from the battleground of their past, Karen knew this was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The fight for justice had been won, and they had secured a future built on truth, trust, and the bond they shared. No longer was Karen haunted by the ghosts of his past. Instead, he looked ahead, knowing that whatever lay in their future, he and Shiro would face it together. The journey was over. Peace had been restored. And for the first time in a long time, Karen felt free. Thank you for following Karen and Shiro on their journey. The fight for justice may be over, but their bond will always remain unbreakable. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of courage and redemption. Also, let us know, where are you watching this from? Which country?